All right, Chapter 52, Population Ecology, Part 2. We're basically picking up where we left off. We're still looking at different factors that can influence the life histories and the changes in population of species over time. Let's look at density-dependent and density-independent factors. So density-dependent factors are simply factors that increase or decrease a population proportionally to the population density. So, in other words, oftentimes what you'll see is as a population density increases, then that's going to affect lots of aspects of the individuals of the population. So, in our population of gray squirrels, as the density goes up, what types of things would you expect to happen? So, as you get more and more squirrels per unit of area, well, there's going to be more competition for acorns, or there's going to be more predators that are drawn to the area, so more squirrels are going to get eaten, or there's fewer good nesting sites because there's more squirrels around to take them up, or whatever. Those are all examples of density dependent factors. So oftentimes in density dependent factors, we can study this by just looking at crowding. So crowding is simply a high population density. And what we find is that crowding typically decreases growth rate, adult size, survival, the number of offspring produced, etc., etc. So here's a bunch of experiments to show that. So if you look here, we've got tadpoles. And so the tadpoles were grown at 6 different densities, either 5 tadpoles per liter all the way up to 160 tadpoles per liter. And we find that the tadpole density affects their body weight. So in other words, the body weight of the tadpole is a density dependent factor. The tadpoles that are grown at low densities end up having a higher mean body weight, and they achieve that weight faster than when tadpoles are grown at a high population density. They grow much more slowly, and then when they max out, their body weight is less than when they were grown at low densities. That should be pretty self-explanatory, I would hope. In other words, if you got a bunch of tadpoles in a pond or in a jar, then they're going to be competing for the resources. And so they're not going to get as much food, they're going to be stressed out, and so they're not going to grow as fast, and they're not going to grow as big. We can see it's true in plants as well. So again, if they're grown at different densities, if they're grown at low density, then they grow larger. If they're growing at high density, then they're smaller. Their probability of survival is higher at low density and lower at high density. All right, so it's true. We could talk about these guys too, but we'll skip it. We also find that fecundity, the amount of offspring that are produced, is a density dependent factor. It's related to density. So in these plants, here they're at low density and here they're at high density, and this is tracking the number of seeds per plant. So when the plants are grown at low density, they produce 23,000 seeds, but when they're produced at high density, they only produce 210 seeds. So what is that? 1%? So why is that? It's the same reasons I talked about with the tadpoles. At high density, there's more competition for space and for water and for light and so on and so forth. So that means there's less energy that's available for reproduction. What's true for plants is also true for birds. So in these guys, at the higher densities, then they lay fewer eggs, and at lower densities, they lay more eggs. So again, it's because of competition for breeding sites and mates and all that stuff. So some other examples of density-dependent interactions include intraspecific and interspecific competition. Intraspecific competition is density dependent. It's the competition between members of the same species. Interspecific competition is also density dependent. Interspecific competition is competition between populations of different species. So we saw examples of intraspecific competition here and here. So these plants are all members of the same species, so it's intraspecific and it's density dependent in terms of the number of seeds they produce. Interspecific competition is also density dependent. So let's say that there's squirrels that are competing with blue jays for acorns. So the higher the squirrel density, the greater the competition with the blue jays. So it's interspecific competition is also density dependent. Predation is density dependent. So the number of antelope getting eaten by lions is going to depend on the density of antelopes and the density of lions. Same with parasitism and disease. A high density squirrel population is more likely to get parasites or get some sort of virus than if they're living at low density. There are also density independent factors. Density independent factors reduce population size or increase population size regardless of density. So usually density independent factors are caused by climate. So in this example in the lower left, we've got an insect called a thrip, and you can see that its population remains more or less at the same density throughout the year, and then we see this big explosion in their population density, and that was due to a I'm sorry guys, Rob Gronkowski just got traded to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's reunited with Tom Brady. How cool is that? So anyway, so these thrips, their population explodes in the spring, and this is a little bit confusing because you're like, no, wait, this isn't the spring, it's November. Well, these guys live in Australia, so it's the Australian spring because they're in the southern hemisphere. All right, so whatever. So it doesn't matter how many thrips there are, it doesn't matter about their density. The climactic conditions change, and that causes their population to grow. Right? So it doesn't matter if there's one per tree or a million per tree, their population is going to grow because of climactic conditions. Here we've got living trees and dead trees. These are some sort of fir tree in Western North America. And so some of this guy died because of climate change. And so climate change is going to affect trees in a density independent way. It doesn't matter what the tree density is. The environmental stresses are going to regulate their population growth, and in this case, contribute to mortality. All right, so density independent is usually due to abiotic conditions like temperature or precipitation or whatever, whereas density dependent factors are usually more about the interactions between the particular species and their resources or other species. We can also group species according to two broad categories, R-selected species and K-selected species. So most organisms fall into one of these two categories, although they do exist on a spectrum. But let me go to this slide, this does a better job of explaining it. So R-selected species will typically um, um, grow really quickly and have populations that can grow quickly and can collapse quickly. K-selected species, the number of species in the population tends to remain more constant, so their population doesn't grow crazy fast and get out of control, and it typically doesn't crash either. So why do we have R and K selected species? Well, R selected species typically start having babies early. They have short lifespans. They often, because of that, they usually have high mortality rate early on. They reproduce early, so they not only get to reproductive age quickly, that they're also reproducing at an early age. They have lots of babies. They have lots of small babies. They don't provide a lot of parental care, and therefore their populations fluctuate. This also means that they can't really respond to environmental change as much. So if it gets hot or cold, these things typically will see their population crash or grow exponentially. So a good example of an R-selected species is a rabbit. K-selected species, a good example of this would be an elephant. It takes them a long time to mature. They live a long time. They don't die. Their mortality rate is low. Usually they've got like type 1 survivorship curve. They don't reproduce until they're older. They have a small number of offspring, but they produce large offspring and they have lots of parental care. So again, different species are going to produce using different lifespan histories, life history characteristics, and they kind of come in these two general categories of R selected and case selected. Um, okay, and here are some terms that we can use to keep track of populations over time. So sometimes when we're studying a population, it might be good to zoom out and look at it on a larger scale. So a metapopulation is a group of neighboring populations that exchange individuals. So while we might study the population of squirrels on Milligan's campus, we might find that some of those squirrels are going across the street to um, Sterling Hills Apartments, and they're, exchanging genes and having babies with each other. So we might consider the Milligan campus population and the Sterling Hills population to be a metapopulation. We can also label populations as source or sink populations. So a source population is a population that's growing and thriving, and individuals will immigrate away from it. Sink populations are often struggling to survive, and they'll accept immigrants, but oftentimes they're not growing in and of themselves, and they're only thriving because they're receiving immigrants. Some species exhibit regular cycles in population size, so not all species have just a constant population size that doesn't change from year to year. Um, but some species see pretty dramatic fluctuations in their population size. So consider this classic example. This is lynxes. See, here's a lynx, and here's a hare, right? And so if you track their populations over time, you see the two populations are linked. So the blue line is tracking hares, and the red line is tracking lynxes. So when there's lots of prey around and their population density becomes large, then there's more hares to eat. So the predators get more meals and are able to have more babies, and so the predator population grows. Eventually, the predator population density is so high that they're eating lots of the hares, and it's a density dependent feedback mechanism. And so the hare population declines because they're getting eaten. When the prey population declines, that means there's less food for the predators, so they go hungry, and the predator population declines. When the predator population declines, the prey population increases, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of like the model, and here's actual data showing those spikes in the predator and prey populations. Let's pause talking about animals for a moment and talk about humans. I mean, technically humans are animals, but you know what I'm saying. Humans are weird, man. So humans have sidestepped a lot of these density dependent controls. So earlier, for example, I mentioned that disease is a density dependent controls on populations. If a population of a particular animal, for example, reaches a high population density, then disease can step in and cause the population density to decline. With humans, it's not usually the case. So in other words, humans can live at a really high population density, and then when disease breaks out, we don't always see a big decline in the population density. This is because we have things like medicine or social distancing or whatever. So humans are kind of weird. And a lot of the things we've been talking about so far don't apply to humans in the same way as they do to wild plants and animals. So humans have an expanded geographical range. In other words, humans are able to live, on Antarctica. How do they do that? Well, they burn fossil fuels to generate heat. They make fancy North Face jackets that keep them warm if they step outside. They can melt ice to create drinking water and so on. So humans can live just about anywhere on Earth because of our technology and because of our ability to manipulate resources. Humans can increase the carrying capacities of habitats. So in other words, a habitat can only hold a particular density of an organism at any time. Milligan's campus can only hold, X number of squirrels. But Milligan's campus can hold a really high density of humans because we're able to grow food through agriculture and keep, milk cows and basically get resources that would otherwise be unavailable to us. So we're able to live, because of these technologies, we're able to live at higher population densities than perhaps we would expect if we weren't doing those things. And then the third reason is because of public health. So because we can sanitize our water and we can cook our food and we can create medicines and so on and vaccines and so on, and then we're able to mitigate a lot of those density dependent pressures of parasites and disease. We can also shoot predators and, you know, we can do a lot of things that help keep us from getting killed. So public health helps our densities to behave in ways that aren't necessarily true for other species. Human population growth varies from nation to nation. So in the picture on the right, picture on the left, you can see the growth rates for different nations. So some nations are growing pretty slowly. That's all the purple ones and the orange ones and the red ones. And some populations are growing pretty quickly. So that's the blue ones. What's up with that? Well, we'll talk more about it in just a minute, but the point is not all human subpopulations are growing at the same rate. All right, and we can see that if we look at how quickly the populations are growing now, we can project into the future. So these places that have high population sizes and high population growth rates are going to see big changes in their populations in the future, whereas the ones that are displaying lower population sizes and slower population growth rates, we don't expect to see as much of a change. So if we project out, we see that 30 years from now, Europe is going to have more or less the same population, but Africa is going to almost, double their population. We also see that the age structure of human populations is going to be important for predicting how they'll change in the future. And so sex ratios and age structures are something that we'll pay attention to. So if you look at this one, this is showing age distributions for different hypothetical populations. So in this one, let's go to this one. In this one, we see that a larger proportion of the population is in the post-reproductive period of their lifespan. So they're in their 50s and 60s and they're not having babies anymore. So what does that mean? That means that this population, because it's top heavy, because the bulk of it is older and there's not as many young ones, this population is going to display negative growth. It's going to get smaller in time. This population, you can see that a large proportion of its population is young and hasn't started having babies yet, so this population is going to grow pretty quickly over time. So in places like the US, we have something similar to this. Europe is something similar to this. And Africa is something similar to this. All right, so this is the same data, just in real time. This is North America, and this is what? Africa in 2014. Cool. All right, so why do we see these differences in growth rate and age distributions and so on? Well, that attempts to be answered by the demographic transition model. So this model describes historical changes in demographic patterns in the industrialized countries versus non-industrialized countries. All right, so what I mean by that is countries develop kind of like organisms. So in other words, countries can be young, and then they can mature, and then they can become old, and that has impacts on the way that they grow. I don't know if that made any sense. Let me just talk you through the graphic. So when a nation or a population is in stage 1, which is called the pre-industrial stage, they will have a relatively high and fluctuating birth rate and a relatively high and fluctuating death rate, right? And then they will have a relatively low population size. Okay, so what's going on here? In the pre-industrial stage, the society doesn't have access to medicine or clean water, perhaps. They don't have college degrees. Maybe they're doing a lot of subsistence agriculture, so a lot of them are farmers. And therefore, they have high birth rate. And because they don't have medicine and clean drinking water, they also have a high death rate. And because they have a high death rate, they have a high birth rate because they need to have more kids to replace the ones that are lost. Over time, as they transition into the transitional stage 2, you can see that they're still having the same high birth rate because they're kind of locked into this mindset that they've had. They're still having large families, but death rate is declining, and death rate might be declining because now they have access to medicine, or they have access to, they're now working as accountants or something, so they're not dying as often, working in the fields. And so because their birth rate is higher than the death rate, then their population starts to increase. And then as their population increases, over time their birth rate starts to decline. So they start having fewer babies. They don't need to replace babies that are dying because death rate is lower. Or maybe they don't need to have a large family because they're not farming anymore. So the birth rate declines. Or maybe they have access to contraceptives. So the birth rate begins to decline, and then the nation enters into the industrial stage. So in the industrial stage, basically now they are able to work in factories and accountants, so they're going to college. And so maybe women have an opportunity to work in the workforce when they didn't have as much opportunity before, because now they're having fewer babies and smaller families, so they have more time to work. And then as we enter in the post-industrial stage, women are maybe even choosing not to reproduce and have babies. They're having careers, and so your birth rate can actually drop below your death rate, and that causes your population size to decrease. So, where is the United States? So which stage are we in? So we are somewhere in here. We're in the post-industrial stage. So in the US, our population would be declining, except we get a lot of immigration. Europe is another example that is in the post-industrial stage, so their population size is declining, and they've been actually mitigating that by increasing immigration rates. Where would Ethiopia be? Ethiopia would be over here in the pre-industrial stage, right? And then places like China are transitioning, have been transitioning to the industrial stage. So anyway, different nations are in different stages, and this is all encompassed by the demographic transition model. Okay, why do we care about human population growth? Well, because humans have a really impactful behavior on ecology and on global climate. So humans have a pretty large ecological footprint. This is defined as the sum total of all the resources we use. So if you think about it, your lifestyle requires a large ecological support system. So every time you eat a fish, that fish had to be caught and was pulled out of the ocean. If you built a house or you live in a house, then that took some space on land, and it's built out of, wood and asphalt and your shingles and glass and your window panes and so on and so forth. When you eat food, well, that salad had to be grown somewhere, so it had to be allocated cropland. If you eat some bacon, there had to be some pigs that were grown somewhere. Or if you eat a steak, there was a cow that was out grazing in a pasture, and also there was farmland that was raising grain for that cow, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, humans, especially humans that live in industrialized or post-industrialized stages, have large ecological footprints, so we're straining the resources in Earth's capacity. So humans can also control population growth by doing things like installing family planning programs. So simply by making contraceptives and education about reproduction available, along with empowering women to have choice over when they reproduce and whether or not they're going to have a career and so on and so forth, humans can actively control how much growth their population is undergoing. So, anyway, humans face choices in terms of reducing ecological footprint and controlling population growth. That sums it up. See you next time.